The sky over Greensburg, Indiana, was the color of wet iron on the morning of March 19th, 1959. A thin rain had fallen before dawn, just enough to turn the courthouse steps into a slick gray sheet, just enough to make a man's boots leave dark prints on the limestone as he climbed up to stand with the crowd. Walter Kovash was 24 years old, and he was about to spend every dollar he had ever earned. He stood at the back of the crowd, behind the insurance men in their press coats, behind the older farmers in their feed store caps, behind the county officials who were already tired of being there. His own coat was denim. It had been patched twice at the elbows and once along the collar, and the patches were not the same shade of blue as the original cloth. His boots were caked in a crust of brown clay from the road, and his hands, large for a man of his build, were shoved deep into his pockets. In the right pocket, folded twice, and tucked inside an envelope was a cashier's check for $3,200. It was every penny he had saved in 6 years of hired labor, every dawn he had watched break over another man's barn, every bale he had stacked, every fence he had mended, every cow he had milked in a stranger's stanchion. All of it condensed into a single piece of paper in his coat pocket. He did not take his hand out to touch it. He did not need to. He could feel it there, the weight of it, the way a man feels the weight of a decision he has already made. The auctioneer was a thin man named Pettigrew, and he had been selling tax-delinquent properties in Decatur County for 22 years. He cleared his throat, glanced at his clipboard, and began to read. Parcel 7, 80 acres, formerly belonging to Emmett Crowder. Southeast quadrant of the county bordered on the east and west by creek branches. Improvements none of value. Drainage poor. Soil classification marginal to non-productive. Opening bid $2,000. A small laugh ran through the crowd. It was the laugh men use when they are standing in the cold and want to remind themselves they are warm. The old Crowder swamp, someone said behind Walt. They're calling it marginal now. That's generous. Emmett worked that place 19 years, another voice said. Worked himself into a hospital bed doing it. Drainage poor. Hell. Drainage impossible. $2,000 for a mud hole. Who'd buy that? A hand went up near the front. It belonged to a man named Hollister, who owned 300 acres of good bottomland a mile north. He raised a finger. 2,100. Another hand, another bid. The number climbed in $100 steps, slow and unenthusiastic, the way a man might climb a ladder he does not believe in. 22, 23, 25. At 2,800, Hollister shook his head and stepped back. The other local farmer stepped back with him. A third voice, one Walt did not know, came from the side of the crowd. A speculator from Indianapolis in a charcoal overcoat who had driven down for the morning. 3,000. Pettigrew scanned the crowd. His eyes moved past the farmers, past the insurance men, past the county clerk. They came to rest on Walt. Walt lifted his hand. He did not shout. He did not even speak loudly. He said the number plainly, the way a man states a fact that is no longer up for discussion. 3,200. The speculator's head turned. He looked at Walt. He looked at Walt's denim coat and his patched elbows and his mud-caked boots. He looked at a 24-year-old farmhand who had no business making a bid that high. Then he looked back at the land description on the board, and he did the calculation in his head, and he shook his head once and looked away. Silence. 3,200 once, Pettigrew said. A crow cried somewhere over the courthouse lawn. 3,200 twice. Walt's hand had come down. His hand was in his pocket again on the envelope. The envelope was warm from his body. Sold. $3,200. 80 acres. Mister. Pettigrew squinted at the form. Mr. Walter Kovash. The crowd did not applaud. The crowd did not even turn to look. A few men glanced over their shoulders, saw the young man in the patch coat, and shook their heads the same way the speculator had shaken his. One older farmer, a man Walt had worked for once in 1956, spat tobacco juice on the limestone step. $40 an acre, the old farmer muttered loud enough for Walt to hear. Good land in this county sells for $200. That boy just paid $40 an acre for a swamp. Lord have mercy. Walt walked to the front. He signed the deed where Pettigrew showed him. He handed over the envelope. The clerk opened it, verified the check, and stamped the document with a red stamp that said paid. Pettigrew shook his hand. Congratulations, son, Pettigrew said. And then he leaned in a little closer and he lowered his voice, the way a man lowers his voice when he is about to say something he does not want the crowd to hear. You know what you just bought. Yes, sir, Walt said. No, I mean, do you know Emmett Crowder worked that ground for 19 years? He lost his teeth to it. He lost his wife to it because she left him over it. And in the end, he lost the ground itself. That parcel has broken 4 men that I personally know of. Maybe more. Yes, sir. I know the history. Pettigrew studied him. The clerk behind the table was watching too. Then God bless you, son, because you're going to need it. Walt nodded once. He folded the deed, which was his now, and he put it inside his coat, against his heart where the envelope had been. Then he walked back down the courthouse steps, past the men who had not been past the men, who had laughed past the old farmer, who had spat, and he went to his truck. His truck was a 1948 Chevrolet with a cracked windshield and a transmission that refused third gear when it rained. He climbed in. He did not drive away at once. He sat there, his hands on the wheel, looking at nothing, looking at everything. He had just become, for the first time in his life, a landowner. He owned 80 acres of the worst ground in Decatur County, Indiana, and he had not told a single soul in the world what he was going to do with it. As he pulled the truck away from the courthouse, he did not drive toward the land. He drove instead toward the small cemetery on the west side of Rush County, where his father was buried. It was 40 miles out of his way. He drove it anyway. He needed to tell someone, and the only person he had ever wanted to tell was no longer above the ground. The cemetery was called Maple Grove, and there were no maples in it, only 3 stunted oaks and a rusted iron fence. Stanley Kovish had been laid there in the fall of 1953 in a plot that cost the family $18, and that Stanley's widow had paid off over 11 months. Walt parked on the gravel lane and walked the last 100 yards with his hat in his hand. The stone was small. It said only Stanley Kovash. 1907 to 1953. Beloved husband and father. Walt stood in front of it for a long time. Well, Pop, he said at last, and his voice was low, the way a man's voice gets when he is trying not to break in front of the dead. I did it. I bought ground today. The wind moved through the stunted oaks. It's not good ground. You always said there'd be nothing cheap that wasn't broken. You were right. This one is broken in the one way you taught me how to fix. He stood there a while longer. I'm going to fix it, Pop. I'm going to make that ground do what it wants to do. Then, Walter Kovash turned around and walked back to his truck, and he drove the 40 miles back to Decatur County, to the land that was now his, to begin the work that would take the next 2 years of his life, and that nobody in the county believed could be done. To understand why a 24-year-old farmhand would spend his entire life savings on 80 acres of standing water and heavy clay, you have to go back 24 years. You have to go back to the farm where Walter Kovish was born, and you have to meet the man who taught him how to see. Stanley Kovash had come to America at the age of 4, carried on the hip of a mother who spoke no English, and a father who spoke only enough to sign the wrong name on the wrong document at Ellis Island in the summer of 1911. The Kovash family had been Kovac before a clerk's pen turned them into something else, and Stanley grew up answering to the new name without ever fully believing it. They came to Indiana because a cousin had come to Indiana. They rented because they could not buy. They rented for the rest of Stanley's life, and then for Walt's childhood, and then as far as Stanley could see, they would rent forever. Stanley was a tenant farmer. He worked other men's land. He paid the rent and a share of the crop, sometimes a third, sometimes a half, depending on how hungry the owner was that year. When the crop was good, the owner took his share, and Stanley made enough to feed his family and put a little in a jar. When the crop was bad, the owner took a share anyway, and Stanley made nothing, and sometimes he made less than nothing, and the family moved. They moved 5 times between 1940 and 1952. They moved from Rush County to Fayette County and back to Rush County. They moved from a 4-room house to a 3-room house to a 2-room house with a porch that sagged. Every move, Stanley Kovash packed the same wooden chest that had come from the old country, and he told his son the same thing. Someday, Walter, someday we will own the land we sleep on. Stanley never owned any land, but Stanley had a gift, and Stanley knew he had a gift, and Stanley was determined that his son would inherit it, even if he could not inherit a single acre of dirt. The gift was water. Stanley Kovash could read water the way other men read scripture. He could walk onto a field he had never seen before, and he could tell you within an hour where the water came from, and where the water went, and where the water refused to leave. He could stand at the corner of a 40-acre tract and look across it, and he could see the invisible slope that a surveyor would have to measure with instruments. He could see it the way another man might see the grain in a piece of oak. Water is the whole story. Walter, he told his son when Walter was 15 years old. They were walking together across a rented field in the spring of 1950, and the field was sodden from a week of rain, and Stanley was pointing at a low area in the middle where the water was pooling. You see that, son? That is not a low place by accident. Nothing in a field is by accident. There is a slope behind us, and the water comes off that slope, and it gets to here, and here it stops. Why does it stop? I don't know, Pop. Because there is a shelf of clay under our feet, 3 feet down or thereabouts, and that water cannot go through the clay. So it sits here and waits to evaporate, and while it waits, our corn drowns. Can we move the clay? Stanley laughed. It was not a bitter laugh. It was the laugh of a man who liked that his son had asked the right question. No, Walter, we cannot move the clay. The clay has been there for 10,000 years. But we can give the water a road. If we dig a channel below the clay and we slope it toward that creek over there, the water will find the channel, and the channel will take it to the creek, and the clay will be just as it was, but the field will be dry. The boy looked at the field and tried to see the channel. He could not see it, but he could see his father seeing it, and that was enough. Remember this, Walter. You control the water, you control the land. You lose the water, the land controls you. Walt was 18 years old when his father died. It was October of 1953. Stanley had taken a job plowing the fall stubble on a rented quarter in Fayette County, and the tractor was an old Alice Chalmers with a worn steering linkage. The owner of the farm had known about the linkage. The owner had not fixed the linkage. Stanley had plowed with it anyway, because if he refused the work, there were 3 other tenant farmers who would not refuse. He was plowing along a slope above a drainage ditch. The linkage failed. The tractor rolled. Stanley was underneath it. A neighbor found him an hour later. The funeral was on a Thursday. It rained. The family buried Stanley Kovash in $18 worth of ground that did not belong to them in a county where they did not live in a plot that his widow would pay off over 11 months. 3 days after the funeral, a letter arrived at the rented house in Fayette County. It was from the owner of the farm. The letter expressed his sincere condolences. The letter also noted that the lease had been in Stanley's name. The letter respectfully requested that the family vacate the property by the end of the month. 30 days. Walter Kovish stood at the kitchen table of the rented house, and he held the letter in his hand, and he read it twice, and then he folded it very carefully and put it in his coat pocket. His mother was in the other room. His mother did not need to see the letter yet. His mother had just buried her husband. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, Walt walked the 3 miles to the cemetery in Rush County. He walked in the dark on a gravel road in shoes that were already too tight. He went to his father's grave. He stood in front of the fresh dirt, and he put his hand on it, and he spoke aloud. "Pop, I'm telling you this so you can hear it. I will never be a tenant. I will own the ground I sleep on, or I will not farm. I will do this for you, and I will do this for me, and I will do this even if it takes me until I am an old man." He walked the 3 miles back. He did not tell his mother what he had said. He did not tell anyone what he had said. He kept it inside him the way a man keeps an ember inside him, the way a man keeps the thing that will either warm him through his life or burn him down. He was 18 years old, and he was the oldest son, and his father was in the ground, and the family had 30 days to disappear. For the next 6 years, Walt worked. He worked at the Henshaw place in Rush County through the summer of 1954. He worked at the Krebs farm in Fayette County in the winter of 1955, baling hay in weather that cracked the skin on his knuckles. He worked one harvest season on a 1,000-acre spread up near Rushville, where the owner had 5 hired men and 6 tractors, and not a single kind word for any of them. He worked at a dairy in Henry County for 14 months, milking cows at 4 in the morning and again at 4 in the afternoon, and he slept in a bunkhouse with 3 other single men who all smelled like cows, and none of whom he remembered by name 2 years later. He made in a good year about $1,100. He spent about $300. He sent another $200 to his mother, who had moved in with her sister in Shelby County. And every dollar that was left, he put in a savings account at the Farmers Bank of Greensburg, where the teller eventually learned his name and started greeting him as Mr. Kovash the moment he walked through the door. By 1958, he had $2,900. By the late winter of 1959, he had $3,300 counting the last paycheck and the last careful subtraction for food and rent. And every day for 6 years while he worked, he looked at ground. He did not look at good ground. He could not afford good ground, and he knew it. He looked at ground that nobody else wanted. He looked at overgrown fields and abandoned pastures and tax-delinquent parcels. He walked the edges of farms where he worked and studied the low spots. He read the Greensburg Daily News every week and circled the tax sale notices. He was not looking for a bargain. He was looking for a specific kind of broken. He was looking for ground that had a problem he knew how to fix, and where every other man who had tried to farm it had tried to fix the wrong problem. He was looking, in other words, for water. When the Crowder parcel appeared in the February 1959 tax sale notice, Walt read the description 4 times. 80 acres, drainage poor. Soil heavy, standing water from February through May. 2 creeks on the east and west boundaries running 4 to 6 feet below field level. Failed crop history 19 years. He folded the newspaper. He put on his coat. He drove 40 miles to the parcel that afternoon, and he walked it for 3 hours in the cold, and he saw what his father had taught him to see. He saw a field that had standing water because the clay hardpan sat 18 inches below the surface and trapped it. He saw two creeks that ran well below the field, waiting to receive water if water could only find its way to them. He saw in his head the network of channels that would connect the one to the other. He saw not a swamp, but a field with a broken drain, and he knew standing there in his boots in the cold March wind that he had found his ground. The afternoon of the auction after the cemetery, after the 40 miles back, Walt drove into Greensburg and parked his truck outside the Farm Bureau Co-op. The co-op was the center of agricultural life in Decatur County. Every farmer passed through its doors at least once a week. And behind the co-op counter in a back office that had slowly grown larger than the counter itself was the local John Deere dealership run by a man named Harlan Briggs. Harley Briggs was 48 years old. He was a big man, built like a silo, with a laugh that could be heard across the parking lot and a handshake that had broken 3 of his own fingers over the years because he did not know his own strength. He knew every farmer in Decatur County by name. He knew their wives by name. He knew their tractors by serial number. He had sold more John Deere equipment in the last 15 years than any dealer in the state below Indianapolis. And he knew to the penny what every farmer in the county owed the bank. When Walt walked into the co-op, Harley was at the counter signing a receipt for a man named Wendell Loomis. Harley looked up, saw Walt, and his face split into the broad professional grin that he used for new customers. "Well now, you must be new in town because I don't believe I've met you." Harley Briggs. Walt Kovish. They shook hands. Harley's hand was like a catcher's mitt. Walt's hand was smaller, but it was hard the way a hand gets hard when it has done 6 years of hired labor. Kovish. Kovish. Harley squinted, thinking. Now, why do I know that name from this morning? I bought the Crowder parcel at the courthouse auction. The grin on Harley's face did something interesting. It did not fall exactly. It adjusted. A man who watched Harley's face for a living would have seen the adjustment. The grin got a little wider, but a little tighter at the corners. His eyes, which had been warm, cooled by about 1 degree. You bought the Crowder parcel. I did. For how much, if you don't mind my asking? $3,200. Harley whistled long and low. It was the whistle a man uses when he wants you to know he has just heard something that he cannot quite believe. $3,200 for the Crowder place. Yes, sir. Son. Harley leaned on the counter. The counter creaked under his elbows. You know, I have sold equipment to the last 4 men who tried to farm that parcel. Every one of them. Do you know what they have in common besides that ground? I have a guess. They are all broke. Every single one of them. Crowder is living in his sister's back room in Indianapolis. The fellow before him, Halverson, he shot himself in 1949. The 2 before that, I don't even know what became of them. The ground ate them. Yes, sir. So what I want to know is, what is your plan? Walt looked at him. Walt had been expecting this question, and he had rehearsed his answer on the drive back from the cemetery, and he had decided somewhere around mile 20 that he was not going to tell Harlan Briggs or anyone else in Decatur County what his plan was. He was going to let the ground tell them when it was ready. I've got a plan, Walt said. That is not an answer. No, sir, it is not. Harley studied him. Then he laughed the big laugh, the one that carried across parking lots. He slapped the counter. All right, Kovish. Play it close. But listen, son, a plan needs equipment. You got a tractor? I do. What have you got? A 1947 Farmall M. Harley's grin adjusted again. This time there was no hiding the adjustment. A 1947 Farmall M. Yes, sir. What did you pay for it? $175. Bought it from the widow Osmond last fall. Her husband ran it for 12 years. It starts every morning. Harley was silent for a moment. Harley was not often silent. When Harley spoke, his voice had lost the salesman polish. It had become something lower, something almost but not quite kind. Walter, I am going to say this as a friend, although we have only just met. You have bought the worst ground in this county. You have bought it with every dollar you own. And you are planning to work it with a 12-year-old tractor that you bought from a widow for $175. Now, I have a brand new John Deere 730 diesel sitting on the lot behind this building. 60 horsepower. It will pull a 3-bottom plow through that clay like butter. I can put you in that tractor for $5,800 financed over 7 years at a rate the bank here will approve today. No, thank you. Son, you are setting yourself up to fail. Maybe. Not maybe, definitely. I have watched 4 men try to farm that ground. 4. I sold equipment to all of them. I watched every one of them quit or go broke. It cannot be done. Not with that soil and that water. Emmett Crowder lost 20 years of his life trying, and all he got was a tax bill he could not pay. Walt picked up the co-op account paperwork that was sitting on the counter. He folded it and put it in his pocket next to the deed. I appreciate the concern, Mr. Briggs. Harley. Harley. I do. But I have got a different idea about that ground. What idea? Walt put his hat on. He walked toward the door. Then he turned back once because something in him wanted to leave the man with at least a thread to pull on in the years to come. You'll see. And he walked out. That was all of it. 312 words from hello to goodbye in the co-op on the afternoon of March 19th, 1959. And for the next 22 months, that conversation was the only conversation Harley Briggs had with Walter Kovash. But Harley Briggs thought about it off and on at the counter and at home and at the Friday night poker games at the VFW hall. He thought about the patched denim coat. He thought about the $175 tractor. He thought about the phrase, a different idea about that ground. And he thought every time the same thought. That boy is going to break. 1 week after the auction on a cold Thursday morning, Walt sat at a table in Murphy's Cafe on the main street of Greensburg. He had come into town for rope and diesel and a pound of coffee. He had stopped at Murphy's because it was cold outside, and he had not eaten since before dawn. He was sitting alone in a booth with a plate of eggs and a cup of coffee and a copy of the Greensburg Daily News open to the agricultural page when the door of the cafe opened and an old man walked in. The old man was 63 years old. His face was a map of 19 bad years. His hands were knotted with arthritis. He wore a coat that had been washed too many times. He scanned the cafe slowly, the way a man does when his eyes are not what they once were. Then he saw Walt, and he walked across the cafe, past 3 empty tables, and he sat down in the booth across from him without asking. You are Walter Kovash, the old man said. Yes, sir. I am Emmett Crowder. Walt set down his coffee cup very carefully, the way a man sets down something that he does not want to spill. Mr. Crowder, I heard you bought my ground. Yes, sir, I did. Emmett Crowder did not look angry. He did not look bitter. He looked tired in a way that went all the way down to the marrow. He looked at Walt for a long moment, and Walt let him look. Walt did not fill the silence. His father had taught him that too. An old man, when he has come to say something, does not need you to help him say it. I farmed that ground for 19 years, Emmett said at last. Yes, sir. I tried everything. I pumped it. I ditched it around the edges. I tried corn. I tried soybeans. I tried oats. One year I tried hay, thinking maybe hay would forgive the water. Hay did not forgive the water. No, sir. I lost my wife over that ground. Not because she died, because she left. She said she could not watch me do it anymore. She said the ground was killing me, and she was right, but I could not stop. I just could not stop. Walt did not speak. In 1958, the county took it for back taxes, $1,840. I did not even go to the hearing. I could not bear it. I live in my sister's back room now. I came up on the bus yesterday because I heard at the co-op that a young man had bought it. Yes, sir. Emmett Crowder reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He took out a folded piece of paper. It was old, and it had been folded and unfolded many times. The creases had worn through in two places. He set the paper on the table between them, and he pushed it gently across toward Walt. This is a map I drew, Emmett said. Over the years, every place on that ground where water stood, every low spot, every time I noticed one, I made a mark, and I wrote the date and the month and how long it stayed. There are 47 marks on that map. It is 19 years of my life on one piece of paper. Walt looked at the map. He did not touch it yet. He looked at Emmett. Why are you giving this to me? Because I have two reasons. The first reason is the hard reason, and I will say it plain. That ground beat me. That ground beats everyone. I do not believe you will farm it. I believe you will lose your money the same as I lost mine, and you will walk away the same as I walked away, except you are 24 and I am 63, and you will have more time to live with the losing. He paused. The second reason is that I watched you at the auction. You were at the auction. I was across the street in the doorway of the feed store. I did not have the stomach to go inside, but I watched. I watched you stand at the back of the crowd, and I watched you raise your hand, and I watched your face when you said the number. And I saw something on your face that I had not seen on any of the four men who tried it before you. I do not know what it was. I am too old to know. But I thought if that boy is going to be stupid, let him be stupid with better information than I had. So I drew this fair copy last night. The original I keep. This one is yours. Walt looked down at the map. Slowly, he put his hand on it. He did not open it yet. He just rested his palm on the paper as if the paper had a pulse, and he was checking to see if he could feel it. Mr. Crowder, may I say one thing to you? Say it. I do not think the ground beat you. I think the water beat you. And I think the ground has been waiting a long time for someone to understand that those are two different things. Emmett Crowder sat very still in the booth across from him. The cook rang the bell in the kitchen. A truck went by outside on Main Street. In the booth behind them, two men were arguing about the price of hogs. What? Emmett said at last in a voice that was almost a whisper. Do you mean by that? I mean that the ground wants to grow. The ground is good. It is Brookston clay, Mr. Crowder. Do you know what Brookston clay does if you drain it? Drain it. Yes, sir. Drain it. Not around the edges. Underneath. 3 feet down below the hard pan. Tile drainage, Mr. Crowder. Clay tile laid in a pattern sloped toward the creeks. 3 miles of it, maybe. The water cannot go down through the hard pan. But if you give it a road underneath, it will take the road. Emmett Crowder stared at him. A man cannot lay 3 miles of tile. One man can, Mr. Crowder, if he has 2 years and nothing else to spend them on. You are going to do this. Yes, sir. I am. Emmett Crowder did not speak for a long time. Then very slowly he reached across the table and he picked up his old worn map from under Walt's hand. He unfolded it halfway. He looked at the 47 marks, 19 years of his life. Every low spot, every standing puddle, every month, and every date he had recorded while his marriage fell apart and his land took him under. He folded the map again. He put it back on the table in front of Walt. If you are going to be crazy, Emmett Crowder said, be crazy with good information. He stood up from the booth. He took $1 from his pocket and put it next to Walt's plate to pay for a coffee he had not ordered. I do not think you will do it, Mr. Kovish. I do not think it can be done. But for the first time in 6 years, I want to be wrong. He walked out of Murphy's Cafe, and Walt never saw him again. Walt sat at the table for a long time after Emmett Crowder was gone. His eggs went cold. His coffee went cold. He did not notice. He had opened the map on the table in front of him, and he was staring at the 47 marks that were 19 years of another man's failure, laid out in a trembling hand on a single sheet of paper. He did not see failure in it. He saw a key. Every mark on Emmett Crowder's map was a place where water had stopped. And every place where water had stopped was a place where a channel needed to go. Emmett Crowder, in 19 years of trying to fight the ground, had drawn, without knowing it, a complete diagnostic chart of the land's hidden plumbing. He had not solved the problem, but he had mapped it perfectly. Walt took a pencil from his coat pocket. He had bought pencils at the co-op that morning because he had known he would need them. He did not write on the map. Emmett's map was not something to write on. But he took the back of the Greensburg Daily News and he laid it over Emmett's map. And he began very carefully to copy the 47 marks onto his own paper. And beside each mark as he copied it, he began to draw the lines that Emmett Crowder had never drawn. The lines that would carry the water away. Outside Murphy's Cafe, the afternoon sun was breaking through the gray. A truck rolled by. A boy on a bicycle rode past the window. The world went on being the world, a small Indiana town, on a cold Thursday in March, and nobody in it knew that a young man in a patched denim coat was sitting in a corner booth drawing the blueprint of a farm that nobody believed existed. He drew until the light began to fail. He paid his bill. He left Emmett's dollar on the table with his own for the waitress. He walked out to the truck, and he drove the 11 miles to the 80 acres that were his. And he parked on the rutted access road, and he walked out into the center of the field with his folded blueprint in his coat pocket and the cold spring wind moving across the standing water around him. He stood there as the sun went down. He did not speak. He did not pray. He only stood and he looked, and he saw laid across the darkening swamp in lines as clear as if they had already been dug the shape of the farm that he was going to build. He went home. He slept 4 hours. And at first light, he hitched the homemade ditching plow to the Farmall M, and he drove it out into the first trench line, and he began to dig. The first trench was 300 feet long, and it took him 11 days to dig. Walt had expected 4. He had expected to hitch the Farmall M to the homemade ditching plow, drop the coulter to 36 inches, and walk the tractor down the line at a steady 2 miles an hour, while the blade sliced a clean furrow through the Brookston clay. That was what his drawings had called for. That was what his calculations had predicted. That was the theory of the thing. The practice of the thing was different. The practice of the thing was that on the morning of March 30th, 1959, with the sun just clearing the tree line on the eastern side of the property, Walt fired up, the Farmall lowered the plow, and engaged the clutch. The tractor lurched forward. The plow blade hit the frost layer 8 inches down and stopped. The tractor did not stop. The tractor kept going, and the plow, anchored in frozen ground, tore loose from the tow bar and cartwheeled sideways into a standing puddle with a sound like a hammer hitting a steel drum. Walt killed the engine. He climbed down from the seat. He walked around to the plow, which was lying on its side in 6 inches of water, and he looked at it for a long time. He did not swear. He did not throw his hat. He took off his gloves and he crouched down in the mud, and he began to examine the tow bar where it had sheared off. He had welded that tow bar himself 2 weeks earlier in the lean-to behind the house he was renting in Greensburg. He had welded it out of a piece of I-beam he had salvaged from a collapsed barn. He had welded it with a borrowed arc welder and rods that cost him 39 cents apiece at the hardware store. He had thought at the time that the weld was strong enough. He had been wrong. He walked back to the truck. He drove to Greensburg. He bought 2 more rods. He drove home. He unbolted the tow bar from the plow. He rewelded it this time with a gusset plate he cut from the same I-beam. He drove back to the field. He rebolted the tow bar. He lowered the plow. He engaged the clutch. The tractor lurched forward. The plow blade hit the frost layer. The weld held for about 4 feet. Then, the plow hit a glacial stone the size of a bread loaf buried 18 inches deep, and the whole rig jumped sideways and tore the tow bar loose again in a different place this time. Walt killed the engine. He sat down in the mud next to his broken plow, and he laughed. He laughed because his father had warned him about exactly this. You will plan for the ground, Stanley Kovash had told his son once many years ago. You will draw your plans on paper at the kitchen table, and the plans will be perfect. And then you will go out to the ground, and the ground will not have read your plans. The ground will have its own plans. You must be willing to learn its plans before yours. Walt sat in the mud and laughed, and then he stood up and he walked back to the truck, and he drove back to Greensburg, and he bought a pry bar, a 6-foot length of chain, and 4 more welding rods. For the next 11 days, he did not dig a trench. He walked the line of the first trench foot by foot with the pry bar. He found every stone larger than his fist. He pried them up by hand. The big ones he wrapped with chain and dragged out with the tractor. He found 17 stones bigger than a football on that first 300-foot line. He stacked them in a pile at the edge of the field. The pile, when he was done, was taller than the hood of the farm all. And every night after the sun went down, he drove back to the lean-to in Greensburg, and he rewelded the tow bar in a new place where it had torn loose, and he reinforced it with another gusset, and he went to bed at midnight and was back in the field at sunrise. By April 10th, he had cleared the first line of stones. On April 11th, he hitched the plow, engaged the clutch, and walked the Far Mall M down 300 feet of Brookston clay at a steady 2 miles an hour. The blade cut a clean furrow 36 inches deep. The tow bar held. The plow held. The tractor held. He reached the end of the line. He turned around. He looked back at what he had done. What? 300 feet. 1 trench. 1 line out of the 47 he had drawn on the back of the Greensburg Daily News in Murphy's Cafe. He had 13,700 feet to go. He took off his hat. He wiped his forehead on his sleeve. And he smiled because for the first time since the auction, he knew not hoped, but knew that it could be done. The word got out fast. Of course it did. In a county the size of Decatur, where the population of the whole place was less than 22,000, and the farming community was maybe a tenth of that. A young man with a homemade ditching plow and a 300-foot trench in the worst ground in the county was not going to go unnoticed. By the end of April, the first of the drive-bys began. They came on Sundays, mostly after church. A pickup would slow down on the access road. Sometimes it would stop. The driver would get out and lean on the fence and look at Walt, who was usually in the middle of the field with the farm all. And the driver would shake his head and the driver's wife would stay in the cab. And after about 2 minutes, the driver would get back in and drive on. Some of them waved, most of them did not. By early May, the rumor had started. A man named Wendell Loomis, who had been standing in the co-op the afternoon, Walt bought the deed, told a man named Pritchard at the feed store that he had heard Walt Kovish was digging a fish pond on the Crowder parcel. A fish pond, Wendell said. Can you beat that? A boy spends every dime he has got on 80 acres of swamp and then sets to digging a pond on top of the swamp. He has lost his mind. Pritchard told 3 other men at the feed store. Each of them told 2 more. By the middle of May, there was not a farmer in Decatur County who had not heard that Walter Kovish was digging a fish pond on the Crowder parcel and had gone completely and unrecoverably insane. Harley Briggs heard it at the co-op counter on a Wednesday afternoon. Harley was ringing up a spool of baling wire for a farmer named Arlo Tipton. Arlo was 71 years old. Arlo had farmed the same 160 acres since 1923. Arlo had an opinion about everything in Decatur County, and Arlo was free with his opinions. You hear about the Kovish boy, Arlo said. What about him? Digging a pond on the Crowder swamp. Been out there for 6 weeks, I'm told. Ripping up the ground with some kind of homemade contraption. A pond. A fish pond. That is what Wendell Loomis told me, and Wendell had it from Pritchard, who had it from somebody over at the elevator. Harley finished ringing up the baling wire. He handed Arlo his change. He did not answer right away. Arlo, Harley said, I would not believe everything Wendell Loomis tells you. Well, what else would he be doing out there? I do not know what he is doing out there. A fish pond on 80 acres. A fish pond that cost him $3,200 and every friend he was ever going to have in this county. That boy is going to be begging for work by September. Harley handed Arlo his receipt. Arlo tipped his hat and walked out. Harley stood at the counter, looking at the door that had just closed, and he found to his own surprise that he was not laughing. He was not laughing because he had been thinking about Walter Kovish for 6 weeks. He had been thinking about the patched denim coat and the $175 tractor and the phrase a different idea about that ground. He had been thinking about it off and on at the counter and at home and at the poker game on Friday nights at the VFW. And every time he had thought about it, he had thought the same thing. That boy is going to break. But a fish pond did not make sense, even for a crazy man. A fish pond did not account for 6 weeks of visible labor. A fish pond did not account for the ditching plow some of the farmers had described. A fish pond did not account for the line of stones the boy was said to be piling at the edge of the field. Harley, on the following Saturday, did something he had not planned to do. He got in his car, a 1957 Buick, and he drove out to the southeast side of the county, and he parked on the access road about a quarter mile from the Crowder parcel, and he walked the rest of the way. He stood at the fence line for 20 minutes. He did not see a pond. He saw one trench. It ran in a perfectly straight line from the far corner of the field toward the West Creek. It was about 300 feet long, 3 feet deep, 18 inches wide. Beside it, farther out in the field, he could see the beginning of a second trench, only about 50 feet dug so far. In the middle of the field, the Farmall M was idling, and Walt was down in the second trench with a shovel squaring out the sides by hand. Harley stood at the fence and watched the boy work for 20 minutes. Walt never looked up. He was not pretending not to see Harley. He had not seen Harley. He was inside his work the way a carpenter is inside a cabinet, the way a violinist is inside a sonata, the way a man is inside a thing he is building that he cannot let himself lose. Harley walked back to his Buick. He drove back to Greensburg. He went into the co-op office, and he closed the door, and he sat down at his desk, and he stared at the wall for a long time. That is not a fish pond, he thought. He did not yet know what it was, but he knew with the same certainty a salesman develops over 25 years of reading other men at close range that Walter Kovash was not crazy. Was whatever Walter Kovash was doing out there on the Crowder Swamp, he was doing it on purpose. Summer came. Decatur County turned green, and the Brookston clay under Walt's trenches turned from frost-stiffened brick to workable cut. Walt dug 6 days a week. He took Sundays off not because he was religious, but because on the seventh day the tractor needed grease, and he needed sleep, and because he had learned early that a man who does not rest for 1 day in 7 will start making mistakes that cost him 2 days. He moved through the 47 mark map on a precise grid. He started in the northeast quadrant and worked south and west. Each trench began at a low spot Emmett Crowder had recorded, and each trench ran on a carefully surveyed slope, 1 inch of fall per 100 feet toward the creek on the appropriate side. The surveying was slow. He had borrowed a transit level from the county surveyor's office in Greensburg. The surveyor was a man named Ed Hillis, and Ed Hillis had known Walt's father 20 years earlier when Stanley Kovash had worked briefly as a hand on a farm Ed's cousin ran in Rush County. Ed had handed Walt the transit in March with no paperwork and no rental fee, and he had said, "Only you bring that back in the shape you got it, son." Walt set the transit at the creek outlet on the east side of the property first because that was the fixed point. He took his elevation from the surface of the creek water on a still morning in early April. Then he walked the transit back across the field in 20-foot increments, and at each increment he set a wooden stake, and on each stake he wrote the exact elevation in pencil. It took him 3 days to stake out a single trench line. He double-checked every stake. He triple-checked the ones where the ground sloped strangely. He did not trust his eye. He trusted his father's rule, which was that a man's eye could lie to him about a slope, but a transit could not. Once a trench was staked, he cleared the stones, welded the plow back together from whatever had torn loose the day before, and ran the Farmall M down the line. The plow cut the main furrow. Then he walked the line behind it with a shovel squaring the sides and checking the depth at every stake, and at every stake he checked the slope with a string level. When the trench was open and squared, he laid the tile. The tile came from a manufacturer in Shelbyville, about 30 miles away. It was 4-inch terracotta pipe, each section 12 inches long, with a plain butt joint. It cost 3 cents a foot, and he bought it 14,000 feet at a time, which is to say he bought whatever his truck would carry, and he drove the truck down to Shelbyville every 10 days or so, and he loaded it until the springs were complaining, and he drove it back at 30 miles an hour with his elbow hanging out the window. He laid the tile on his knees. He worked his way down the trench 1 section at a time, fitting each piece against the last, covering each joint with a shovelful of gravel that he had hauled up from the creek bed in 5-gallon buckets on weekends. He did not let another man near the tile. He did not want another man near the tile. This was the work his father had drawn for him on a rented kitchen table in 1950, and this was his inheritance, and he was going to do it himself. By the end of July, he had laid 4,000 feet of tile. By the end of August, he had laid 5,700. By October, when the ground began to stiffen, and the evenings came on cold, and the rain turned from summer rain to the long gray autumn rain that Indiana gets, he had laid 8,300 feet, and he was out of money. He had $23 in his savings account. He sat at the kitchen table in the rented house in Greensburg on the evening of October 19th, and he went through his books. He had kept the books himself in a composition notebook he had bought at the dime store in February. Every expense was there. Tile, 3 cents. A foot times 8,300 feet, $249. Diesel, $12 a month for 7 months, $84. Welding rods across the whole season, $41 and change. Food, $32 a month. Rent on the house, $18 a month. Sundry, the occasional haircut. A new pair of work gloves, a replacement clutch cable for the farm awl. He had spent almost every dollar of the $3,300 he had brought out of the auction with a little left over. And he had 5,700 feet of tile still to lay. And winter was coming, and the ground would not take a shovel once it froze. He closed the notebook. He walked to the window of the kitchen. He looked out at the yard, which was a small yard, on a small street, the rental house of a man who owned no land, but a deed to 80 acres of broken swamp. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he put on his coat, and he got in his truck, and he drove 11 miles to the Whitaker place on the north side of the county. Ross Whitaker was 56 years old. He owned 340 acres of good bottom land along the East Fork of the Flat Rock River. He ran a beef operation, about 90 head of Herefords, and he kept 60 acres in corn and 40 in hay. He was a square-shouldered man with a permanent squint from 30 years of looking into the sun, and he had employed Walt for one winter in 1956 and one summer in 1957, and he had known Walt's father slightly years before. Walt found him in the machine shed pulling the oil pan on a Massey Harris combine. Ross. Ross Whitaker looked up. He did not put down the wrench. Walter. I need winter work. Ross nodded slowly. He slid out from under the combine. He wiped his hands on a rag. I heard you bought your own ground. I did. I heard you were digging something out there. I am. I heard you ran out of money. You heard right. Ross Whitaker studied him. Then he nodded once. Bunkhouse is empty. Pay is $1 a day, plus meals, plus the cot. Feed the cattle at 5, clean the barn, fix fence, do what I tell you, from November 1 to April 1, 5 months. Yes, sir. You will come back out in the spring and dig the rest of your ditch. Yes, sir. And when you bring in your first crop off that ground, Walter, you will come here and you will tell me exactly how you did it, because I have been looking at the Crowder Swamp for 34 years, and I do not believe it can be done, and I would like to know if I am wrong. Yes, sir. I will do that. Ross Whitaker held out his hand. It was covered in old engine oil. Walt shook it anyway. November 1, Ross said. Walt moved into the bunkhouse on November 1st, 1959. The bunkhouse was a 16 by 20 foot building behind the machine, shed with 4 cots, a wood stove, and a single kerosene lamp. Walt was the only hand on the place that winter. The other cots were empty. He stoked the stove at night and broke the ice on the water bucket in the morning, and fed the cattle at 5, and cleaned the barn stalls by 7, and spent his afternoons mending fence in wind that cut through denim like a knife. And every night after supper, after the kerosene lamp was lit, he sat at the small table by the stove, and he took out the composition notebook and he worked. He redrew the drainage plan from memory. He had memorized it by now. Every line, every stake, every slope. He drew it larger this time on butcher paper he bought at the grocery in Greensburg on his first Saturday off, and he hung the butcher paper on the bunkhouse wall above the table. He worked on it every night. He refined the curves where the main trunk line met the creek. He recalculated the slope on the long central line, because on a second check he had found a spot where the grade was shallower than he had thought, and he could not afford a single flat spot in 13,000 feet of pipe, or the whole system would back up at the weak point. He went to bed at midnight. He got up at 4:30. He did it every day for 151 days. And on the first day of April 1960, Walter Kovash shook Ross Whitaker's hand for the second time, collected his pay of $151, loaded his composition notebook and his butcher paper and his work clothes into the 1948 Chevrolet, and drove back to the Crowder parcel to begin his second year of digging. The second year was harder. The second year was always going to be harder. The easy trenches, the short ones in the least stubborn ground, had been dug the first year. What remained was the long central trunk line, which had to run almost the full length of the property on a precise slope, and the three largest branch lines in the heavy ground in the southwest corner, where the hard pan was closer to the surface and the stones were bigger. He had also, by this time, attracted a new kind of attention. In April of 1960, a man from the Greensburg Daily News drove out to the parcel. His name was Sam Petrie, and he wrote a twice-weekly column called Around the County. He was 52 years old, heavy-set, and he smoked continuously. He parked on the access road, walked to the fence, and called out to Walt, who was down in the central trunk line with a shovel. "Mr. Kovash!" Walt climbed out of the trench. "Yes, sir." "Sam Petrie, Daily News. I have been hearing about you for a year." "Yes, sir." "People are saying you are digging a pond. I am not." "Some say a bunker of some kind." "No, sir." "One fella down at the elevator thinks you are hunting Indian relics. Says his grandfather found a pot on this parcel in 1887. Walt almost smiled. "No, sir. I am not hunting relic." "Then what in God's name are you doing out here, son?" Walt looked at Sam Petrie for a long moment. He looked at the notebook in Sam's hand, and the pencil tucked behind Sam's ear, and the column in the Daily News that he himself had read every Tuesday and Friday for 9 years. "Mr. Petrie," he said, "I would appreciate it if you did not write about me yet. 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 Son, you are the biggest piece of agricultural gossip in this county. A man digs a 300-foot trench. That is news. A man digs a trench from one side of 80 acres to the other. That is a story. You want to tell me you are not a story. I want to ask you not to write about me until I am ready to be written about. When will you be ready?" "Around this time next year, maybe September of 1961. Sam Petrie looked at him. He took the pencil from behind his ear, put it in his shirt pocket, and closed the notebook. "All right, Kovish. September of 1961. I will wait. But if you stiff me on this story, I will write a worse one." "Fair enough." Sam Petrie walked back to his car. He drove away. He kept his word. Not one word about Walter Kovish appeared in the Greensburg Daily News between April of 1960 and September of 1961. Sam Petrie, who was a better man than he pretended to be, waited. May of 1960 was wet. June was wetter. By the middle of June, Walt had been digging in mud up to his thighs for 3 weeks, and the Farmall M was throwing a rear tire chain about every 11 minutes, and he was behind schedule. On the evening of June 19th, he drove into Greensburg to pick up a new set of chains from the hardware store. He passed the window of Murphy's Cafe on his way. Inside the cafe, sitting at the counter, he saw the backs of 3 men he knew: Arlo Tipton, Wendell Loomis, and Harley Briggs. He did not stop. He kept walking to the hardware store. He bought his chains. He paid in cash. He turned to leave, and as he stepped out into the street, he heard Arlo Tipton's voice coming through the open door of the cafe next door. Pond, bunker, Indian relics. Anybody's guess, really. The boy has not planted a seed in 15 months. 15 months. His money is gone, I am told. His tractor is on its last legs. I would give him until the first frost. You said first frost last year, Arlo, said Wendell Loomis. I was generous last year. This year, I am precise. And then, Harley Briggs's voice, low, cutting through the other two, like a knife through warm butter. Shut up, Arlo. There was a silence in the cafe. It lasted 3 full seconds. What did you say, Harley? I said, shut up. I am tired of hearing it. That boy has not asked you for a dime, and he has not asked you for a favor, and he has not asked you for your opinion. Leave him alone. Harley, you yourself told me in this very cafe last June that the boy was going to break. I did say that, and I was wrong to say it. Shut up, Arlo. Walt, standing on the sidewalk outside, with his paper sack of chains in his hand, did not move for a moment. Then, very quietly, he walked back to his truck. He set the chains on the passenger seat. He started the engine. He drove the 11 miles back to the parcel, and he parked at the edge of the field, and he sat in the cab of the truck for a long time in the dark, with his hands on the wheel looking at nothing. He did not know yet that Harley Briggs had turned or was turning. He had heard one exchange on one evening through one open cafe door. It might have meant everything. It might have meant nothing. He got out of the truck. He walked out into the middle of the field with no lantern in the half light of a June evening past where the tile had been laid to the leading edge of the central trunk line, which was still open to the sky. He stood at the edge of the trench. The trench was 3 feet deep. At the bottom, a thin ribbon of rainwater was already moving sluggishly in the direction he had designed it to move. 1 inch of fall per 100 feet. It was working. It had been working for a year and 3 months. Under the ground, invisible to every man who had driven past and shaken his head, the 8,300 feet of tile he had already laid was taking water out of the field and carrying it by gravity to the creeks. The low spots on Emmett Crowder's map were drier this June than they had been in April. The standing water in the northeast quadrant was gone. The northeast quadrant, for the first time in the 40 years it had been under cultivation or attempted cultivation, was dry ground. Walt had not spoken about it to anyone. He did not speak about it now. He stood at the edge of the trench, and he watched the ribbon of water move, and he said only under his breath, so that no one heard him but himself and possibly his father, wherever his father was, "It works, Pop. It works." One night in late July of 1960, a night so hot that even at 10 o'clock the air in the field was still thick, Walt was walking the completed section of the north trunk line with a hurricane lamp in his hand. He was checking the outlet at the East Creek. He heard a car on the access road. He turned his head. He saw headlights stop and then dim and then go out. He heard a car door open and close. He heard boots on gravel. A man was walking across the field toward him. Walt stood still with the lantern. He did not call out. He waited. The man came into the circle of lantern light. He was big. He was holding his hat in his hand. It was Harley Briggs. Walt did not speak. "Walter." "Harley." "I was driving home from the VFW. I saw your truck up on the road. I thought I would walk in." "Yes, sir." Harley did not look at Walt. He looked at the trench. He looked at the lantern. He looked at the rope that Walt used to mark the line of the next section, which ran off into the dark beyond the lantern's reach. "What are you doing out here, son?" Walt looked at him. Harley was not smiling. Harley was not doing the big salesman laugh. Harley was standing in a field in the dark with his hat in his hand, and he was asking a question that he wanted an answer to. Walt thought about it. Then he thought it his time. Harley Briggs is the first man who asked after Emmett Crowder, who has earned the answer. I am talking to the water, Harley. Talking to the water. Yes, sir. My father used to say water is the whole book. You control the water, you control the land. This ground has been drowning for 40 years because nobody has given the water a road. I am giving it a road. A road. Underground. Clay tile. 3 feet down. Below the hard pan. Sloped toward the creek's 1 inch per 100 feet. I have laid 8,300 feet. I have about 5,700 to go. Harley Briggs was silent. He did not speak for a long time. The crickets in the grass at the edge of the field sang their summer song. The lantern hissed. Somewhere across the creek, a dog barked once and went quiet. Tile drainage. Yes, sir. By yourself? By hand? The farm-all helps. $175 farm-all. Yes, sir. Harley Briggs turned his hat over in his hands. He looked at the ground. Then he looked at Walt. Walter, I owe you an apology, but I am not ready to make it tonight. I am going to go home, and I am going to think about what I just saw, and I am going to come back sometime when I have the right words. But I will tell you one thing right now. Yes, sir. I sold 112 tractors this year, Walter. I run the biggest John Deere franchise south of Indianapolis. I know everybody in this county, and I know what every man is doing on his ground. And I have never in 25 years in this business seen a man do what you are doing. Not one. Yes, sir. You are either going to be the biggest fool in Indiana, or you are going to teach every farmer in the state something they did not know they needed to learn. And I do not know which it will be. But I am done calling you a fool. That part is over. Tonight. He put his hat back on. Good night, Walter. Good night, Harley. Harley Briggs walked back across the field in the dark. He reached his car. He started it. The headlights came back on. He drove away down the access road, and his tail lights dipped and rose over the ruts, and the dust hung in the air behind him, red in his own tail lights, until the car was gone, and the dust settled, and the field was quiet again. Walt stood at the edge of the trench with the lantern. He did not smile. He did not need to smile. He had been seen. And being seen by the man in the county whose job it had been to size him up and write him off was worth, he thought, more than any apology that would come later. He picked up the lantern. He walked back to his truck. He drove home. He slept 6 hours. At sunrise on July 24th, 1960, he was in the field again, laying tile. The work continued. August, September, October. He laid the last section of tile on November 2nd, 1960. The final piece was a 4-inch elbow at the confluence of the central trunk line and the north branch 40 feet from the East Creek outlet. He fitted it. He packed gravel around the joint. He backfilled the trench with the dark clay he had lifted out of it 18 months before. He stood up. He looked back across the field. The field was smooth. There was no trench visible. There was no tile visible. There was only 80 acres of dark turned earth with the last pale light of a November afternoon on it, and a thin ribbon of clear water flowing steadily out of a 4-inch clay mouth at the creek bank, draining into the East Creek at a rate that had not been possible on that ground in any year since the glacier had left. Walt took off his hat. He did not pray. He was not a man who prayed. But he stood at the edge of the field for a long time with his hat in his hand, and he spoke out loud to nobody in particular, in the voice a man uses when he knows he is alone. I did my part, Pop. The wind moved through the scrub timber on the northwest corner. Now it is the ground's turn. He put his hat back on. He walked to the truck. He drove to the rented house in Greensburg. He heated a can of beans on the stove. He ate them with a piece of bread. He went to bed at 8 o'clock and he slept for 14 hours, which was the longest sleep he had had since March of 1959. He woke up on the morning of November 3rd, 1960, and for the first time in 20 months, he had nothing he needed to dig. He had instead a field to plant in the spring. He had $311 left in his savings account, which he had refilled to $350 a month earlier by selling his winter labor at the Whitaker place once again on a weekend arrangement Ross had offered him when he had seen the boy in September and known without asking that the money was gone. He had a wedding to seed the cheapest hybrid he could find at the co-op, and he had a bag of fertilizer to buy, and he had diesel to put in the farm all. He had a whole county watching. He had everything riding on one crop. And on the morning of May 4th, 1961, he drove the Farmall M out into the middle of the Crowder parcel with a 2-row planter behind it, and he dropped the first seeds of Indiana hybrid corn into ground that no man in 40 years of recorded attempts had been able to harvest. Through May, the corn came up in thin, pale rows, the way all corn comes up. Through June, it thickened. Through July, it did something else. By the last week of July, a farmer named Paul Trager, driving from Greensburg to his own farm on the eastern edge of the county, past the Crowder parcel on the access road at about 6 in the evening, in the long golden light of a summer evening, and he slowed his truck down without knowing exactly why. Then he stopped his truck. He got out. He stood at the fence. Paul Traeger had farmed 40 years. He knew good corn when he saw it. He was looking right now across the fence line at corn that was darker green than any corn he had seen that year. The stalks were thicker. The ears were setting at a height he did not believe. And the corn on the Crowder parcel, which he had driven past 1,000 times in his life and had never seen produce anything but failure, was taller and fuller and better by a clear and undeniable margin than the corn on his own 100-acre field a mile to the east. Paul Traeger stood at the fence for 15 minutes. He got back in his truck. He drove home. He did not tell his wife what he had seen. He did not tell anyone. He thought all the way home that his eyes had been fooling him, that the evening light had been playing tricks, that he had misremembered his own fields. The next morning at sunrise, he drove back out to the Crowder parcel, and he looked again. His eyes had not been fooling him. By the first week of August, Paul Traeger had told 4 other farmers. Those 4 had told 10 more. By the middle of August, every man with a truck in Decatur County had driven past the Crowder parcel at least once, and every one of them had stopped, and every one of them had stood at the fence, and every one of them had come away with the same quiet and unwelcome thought. The boy was growing the best corn in the county on the worst ground in the county, and no one could understand how. On the night of August 26th, 1961, a storm came in from the west. The Weather Service at Indianapolis had been tracking it for 2 days. It had been called a possible heavy rain event. By late afternoon on the 26th, it was being called something else. The dispatcher at the Decatur County Emergency Office sent word to the volunteer fire department at 10 in the evening to be ready for flooding. The rain began at 11:12. It fell in a way that older farmers afterward would describe by shaking their heads and looking at the floor. 4 inches on the county rain gauge at the courthouse between 11 at night and 5 in the morning. 4 inches in 6 hours. The Flat Rock River topped its banks at 3 in the morning. Low fields across Decatur County went under in the dark. Farmers who had not been out of bed for a weather event in 20 years were out in their yards at 4 in the morning, in rubber boots, holding flashlights, watching the water rise. On the Crowder parcel, Walter Kovish was awake in the rented house in Greensburg. He was not in the field, The field was 11 miles away, and there was nothing he could do for it in the dark. He sat at the kitchen table with the single bulb on over the sink, and he listened to the rain on the roof, and he waited for it to stop. The rain stopped at 5:21. At 6:30 first light, he got in the truck and he drove. He drove through flooded low spots on the access road. He drove past Paul Traeger's eastern field, which was 2 feet underwater across 20 acres. He drove past 3 other farms where the corn stood in lakes, where no lakes had been the day before. He drove past fields he had known all his life, where the crop of 1961 had been as of the night before the finest crop the county had seen in a decade, and was now, as of 6:30 on the morning of August 27th, a total and unrecoverable loss. He came over the low rise on the access road at 6:41, and he stopped the truck and he got out. He walked to the fence. The Crowder parcel stretched in front of him in the gray morning light, 80 acres of corn standing tall against a clear, rain-washed August sky. Not one puddle, not one pooled acre, not one drowned row. He walked along the fence line to the East Creek outlet. The creek was high, running hard and brown with the runoff of the whole county. But at the 4-inch clay mouth of his tile outlet, clear water was flowing out of the ground in a steady, unhurried stream, and it was joining the brown water of the creek, and it was going where it was supposed to go. Walter Kavash stood at the mouth of his own drainage system on the morning after the storm of the century on that ground, and he watched the clear water come out of the pipe for a long, long time. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. The ground had spoken for him. He harvested alone. That was the thing that years later the older men in Decatur County would remember first. Not the yield. The yield they could recite like a catechism by the time another decade had passed, 127 bushels to the acre against a county average of 72. They knew the number. They told the number. But before they told the number, they told the fact that the boy had harvested that first crop alone. He had no combine. He could not afford a combine. A new combine was more than the land had cost him, and a used combine was more than he had to spare. What he had was a 2-row corn picker he had bought at a farm sale in Ripley County in the spring for $90 from the estate of a man who had died before the planting. The picker was old. It had a broken shear pin replacement box and one wheel that tracked slightly out of true, and it pulled behind the Farmall M like a dog on a short rope. He started picking on the morning of September 28th, 1961. He picked from sunrise to sunset. He did not stop for lunch. He carried a sandwich in his coat pocket wrapped in wax paper, and he ate it in the driver's seat of the Farmall when he reached the end of a row and had to turn the rig around. He drank from a thermos of coffee that had gone cold before 9 in the morning and lukewarm by noon. He picked corn 2 rows at a time across 80 acres, and he hauled each wagon load of ears to the crib he had built along the east edge of the property in August out of rough sawn lumber he had bought on credit from a mill in Osgood, and paid off week by week with the last of his labor money from Ross Whitaker. He picked for 21 days. On the evening of the 10th day, Paul Traeger drove his own pickup out to the access road. He did not get out. He sat in the cab with the window down and watched Walt work the long central rows in the dusk. The Farmall's headlights were on. The picker was throwing ears into the wagon in a steady, rhythmic chatter. The wagon was nearly full. Paul Traeger sat there for 20 minutes. Then he drove home. He told his wife over supper that he had never in his life seen a man work that hard on a piece of ground. His wife, who had heard the Kavash gossip from the ladies' circle at the Methodist church 3 months earlier, and had been forming her own opinion since, said only, "That boy is going to change this county." And Paul Traeger, who had thought the same thing but had not yet said it out loud, nodded over his coffee and did not disagree. On the afternoon of October 18th, 1961, Walter Kovish drove his last wagon load of ear corn the 11 miles from the Crowder parcel to the Greensburg grain elevator. He pulled the farmall up to the scale. He killed the engine. He got down from the seat. He walked into the scale house. The scale operator was a man named Eldon Rash. Eldon was 61 years old. He had been weighing grain on that scale for 29 years. He had weighed the corn off the Crowder parcel twice before in his life, both times under Emmett Crowder, and both times it had been a partial wagon that barely registered and had been priced at whatever the elevator was offering that week for feed grade. Walter, Mr. Rash, what have you got? Last load. How many loads is that total, son? 41. Eldon Rash wrote the tare weight. He directed the wagon forward onto the platform. He wrote the gross. He did the subtraction in pencil, the old way, in a book he kept at his elbow. Then he stopped. He looked at the book. He looked at the book again. He went to the file drawer on the wall behind him, and he pulled the running tally he had been keeping on Walter Kovash since the 28th of September, and he added the last figure. He stared at the total. He opened the book again. He did the subtraction a third time. Walter. Yes, sir. Step over here a minute. Walt stepped into the scale house. Eldon Rash turned the book so that Walt could see it. Walt looked at the numbers. He had been keeping the same numbers in his own composition notebook every night by the kerosene lamp at the kitchen table. He had known what the total was going to be before he drove the last wagon in. Yes, sir, Walt said. Walter, that is 127 bushels to the acre. Yes, sir. Off 80 acres. Yes, sir. Walter, the county average this year is 72. The best farm in this county, which is the Gabbard Place out on the West Fork, came in at 98 2 weeks ago, and Jim Gabbard was buying rounds at the VFW on the strength of it. Yes, sir. Eldon Rash closed the book. He walked to the telephone on the wall. He picked up the receiver. He did not dial right away. He stood there with the receiver in his hand, looking at Walt, and Walt looked back at him, and neither man spoke. Then Eldon Rash dialed a 3-digit interoffice number, and when the voice on the other end answered, he said only, Lloyd, you are going to want a down command. Street to the scaled house. Show sweet eyes. Lloyd Merriman was the elevator manager. Lloyd came down. Lloyd looked at the book. Lloyd looked at Walt. Lloyd, who was not a man who lost his composure, lost his composure. He said a word he did not often say in the scale house. Then he walked back to his office and he called the county extension agent at his home because it was already past 5, and he told the extension agent that he needed to come see something in the morning. The extension agent was a man named Oliver Renfro. He was 58 years old. He had been the Decatur County extension agent for 22 years, and before that, he had been the assistant extension agent for 9. He had a degree in agronomy from Purdue. He had seen every kind of ground in this part of Indiana, and he had seen every kind of yield, and he had in 31 years in that office developed opinions that most people in the county considered unchallengeable. He drove out to the Crowder parcel on the morning of October 19th, 1961, with Lloyd Merriman in the passenger seat of his county car. Walt was at the crib when they arrived. He was cleaning the corn picker. He had the shear pin replacement box open on a tarp, and he was greasing the chains. He stood up when the car pulled in. He wiped his hands on his pants. He walked over. Mr. Renfro. Mr. Kovish, I understand you have brought in a crop. Yes, sir. Would you walk me across your field? Walt nodded. He led them out into the 80 acres. It was the first time any official person from the state or the county had walked that ground since the auction. Oliver Renfro walked with his hands behind his back the way he always walked, and he stopped every 100 feet or so, and he knelt, and he took out a small toolkit, and he pulled up a clod of soil, and he broke the clod between his fingers, and he smelled it. He did this for 40 minutes. At the East Creek outlet, he stopped for a long time. He crouched at the 4-inch clay mouth of the tile. Clear water was flowing out of it in a steady, unbroken stream, as it had been flowing uninterrupted since the afternoon Walt had laid the last section of tile 11 months before. Oliver Renfro put his hand under the water. He tasted it from his fingertip. He stood up. He looked at Walt. "Mr. Kovish, how much tile did you lay?" 14,000 feet. "By yourself?" "Yes, sir." "In how long?" 2 years. "With what?" "A Farmall M and a homemade ditching plow and a shovel." Oliver Renfro, who had an agronomy degree from Purdue and who had seen every kind of ground in eastern Indiana and who had an opinion about every crop in the county, opened his mouth to say something and then did not say it. He closed his mouth. He looked out across the field at the dark green stubble of harvested corn, at the crib full of ears, at the clear water running into the East Creek. "Mr. Kovish," he said at last, "I have been the extension agent in this county for 22 years. Before that, I was the assistant for 9. And in those 31 years, I have never not once seen what you have done here." He did not say anything else. He walked back to the car. He drove back to Greensburg. That afternoon, in his office, he typed a 2-page report on the Kovish parcel, and he sent a copy to the Purdue Department of Agronomy in West Lafayette, and he sent a copy to the Indiana State Board of Agriculture in Indianapolis, and he kept a copy in his own file that he would, over the next 30 years, show to every young farmer who came into his office asking what was possible on a piece of bad ground. And Sam Petrie of the Greensburg Daily News, who had kept his word for 18 months, came out to the Crowder parcel on the morning of October 20th with his notebook, and Walt met him at the fence, and Walt told him everything. The column ran on Tuesday, October 24th. It was the longest around the county piece Sam Petrie ever wrote. The headline was simply "The Kavash Drainage." By the weekend, the county was driving out to the parcel. They came in pickups and in cars. They parked along the access road. They stood at the fence. They did not shake their heads anymore. They stood mostly quiet, and they looked, and after a while they got back in their vehicles, and they drove home, and at supper that night they told their wives the same thing Paul Traeger had told his wife 6 weeks before. Harlan Briggs drove out on a Saturday. He parked his Buick on the access road a quarter-mile away, the way he had parked it 17 months earlier. He walked the rest of the distance on foot, the way he had walked it then. But this time he did not stop at the fence. This time he opened the gate. He walked into the farmyard. Walt was in the lean-to behind the house, sharpening the shear on the corn picker. He looked up as Harley approached. Harley stopped about 10 feet from him. He took off his John Deere cap. He held it in both hands in front of him, the way a man holds a hat at a funeral. "Walter." "Harley." 127 bushels to the acre." "Yes, sir." "On this ground." "Yes, sir." Harley looked down at the cap in his hands. Then he looked up. "Walter, I owe you an apology. I told you in my office in 1959 that you could not farm this ground. I told you 4 men had failed at it. I told you were setting yourself up to lose everything you had. I was wrong. I was wrong about the ground, and I was wrong about you. And I have been wrong about both of them for more than 2 years. And I owe you the apology, and I am here to make it. Harley." Let me finish, son. Walt closed his mouth. I have sold tractors in this county for 25 years. It is a good living. I have been proud of it. But I want to tell you something I have been thinking about off and on since the night I walked out to your field with the hurricane lamp in the dark. I have spent 25 years selling the machines that work the ground. You spent 2 years fixing the ground so the machines could work it. I think, Walter, that you had the better idea. Walt set down the file he had been using on the shear. He wiped his hands on his pants. He looked at the big man in front of him. Harley, he said, you were doing your job. I will not take an apology for a man doing his job. Then take it because I want to give it. And take it because you and I are going to be in this county for the rest of our lives, and I would like us to be on good terms. Walt nodded. We are on good terms, Harley. Harley put his cap back on. He did not offer to shake hands. They had not shaken hands on the day they met, and it would have felt wrong somehow to shake hands now, as though something had been resolved that did not need a handshake to seal it. He turned to go, then he turned back. Walter, one more thing. If you ever want a John Deere, I will sell it to you at cost. Just cost, not $1 of margin. Thank you, Harley. I will stick with the farm all. Harley laughed. It was the big laugh, the one that carried across parking lots. But it was a different kind of laugh now. It had something softer under it, something that had not been in it 17 months before. I figured you would say that. He walked to his car. He drove away. Walt finished the shear, and he put the file away, and he stood for a minute in the lean-to, looking out at the 80 acres that were his. And he did not smile, but he let himself breathe out long and slow for the first time in nearly 3 years. The work of the next 20 years was quieter than the work of the first 2. Walt farmed the 80 acres with the Farmall M. He did not buy a new tractor. He did not finance equipment. He did not take out a loan of any kind. He planted corn on 2/3 of the ground and soybeans on the rest on a 3-year rotation the way Purdue was recommending by the mid-60s. The yields from the drained Brookston clay held steady. 110 to 130 bushels of corn per acre year after year, while the county average drifted in the 70s and 80s. When Purdue sent a young agronomy student out in the summer of 1964 to take soil samples for a study on glacial till drainage, the student spent 3 days on the Covish parcel and wrote in his notebook on the last evening a line that Walt never saw, but that Oliver Renfro, who read the student's report at Purdue a year later, underlined in pencil, the Covish system is not only sound engineering, it is sound theology. The student later became a professor. The drainage tile Walt had laid by hand in 1959 and 1960 became, in the quiet way these things become, a regional legend. Word got out the way word gets out in farm country, which is to say slowly at first and then all at once. By 1963, farmers from 3 counties were calling Walt on the telephone that he had installed in the rented house in Greensburg, asking if he would come tile their fields. He said yes. He charged $1.50 per foot of tile installed, which was roughly half of what the commercial drainage companies out of Indianapolis charged. He did the work himself with the Farmall and the homemade ditching plow and the same shovel he had used on his own ground. He worked evenings after his own planting was in, and he worked weekends between his own harvests, and he tiled over the course of 9 years another 240 farms in 4 counties. He made from the drainage work between $4,000 and $6,000 a year, depending on the season. He did not spend it. He did not know how to spend it. He had grown up on rented ground where there had never been extra money. And now that there was extra money, he put it week after week and year after year into the savings account at the Farmers Bank of Greensburg. where the same teller who had known his name in 1958 had become by now the bank's vice president and greeted him by standing up when he walked in the door. By 1970, Walt had $62,000 in the savings account. By 1975, he had $118,000. He lived in the same rented house in Greensburg until 1967, when he bought a small farmhouse on the north edge of the Crowder parcel from a widow for $3,200, which struck him when he signed the papers as the exact price he had paid for the land itself, and struck him as the kind of coincidence his father would have appreciated. He built a small addition on the house in 1968. He put in a well. He lived there quietly for the rest of his farming life. He never married. He had opportunities. He was asked by one of the Troger daughters in 1969, and by a widow from Westport in 1972, and by one of his own cousins on his mother's side in 1974, when his mother was still alive and interested in the question. He declined each of them kindly. He had given himself to the ground at 24, and by the time he was 40, the ground had become wife and child and purpose, and there was no room in him for another claim. His son Curtis was not born then. Curtis would come later, and in a way that Walt himself did not expect. In 1976, Walt's sister Ellen died. Ellen had married a man named Carl Dworsky in 1956 and had lived in Muncie. She had one son, 8 years old, whose name was Curtis. Carl Dworsky, who was not a steady man, disappeared 3 weeks after the funeral, and Curtis was left with no one. Walt drove to Muncie on a Sunday in November of 1976, and he brought the boy home in the cab of his pickup, and he raised him. He was 41 years old when he became a father. He raised Curtis on the farm. He taught him as his own father had taught him to read water. He taught him to weld and to change oil in a farm-all and to lay clay tile in a trench. By the time Curtis was 14, he could take a grade with a transit level as well as any man in the county. By the time he was 18 in 1986, he had his own drainage jobs going in the summer. He went to Purdue for 2 years and studied agronomy, and then he came back because Purdue could not teach him what his uncle, who he called Dad, had already taught him, and because the farm had begun by then to grow in ways that needed him. That is a part of the story that belongs later. It belongs in the section after the Great Expansion. The Great Expansion began as everything great in Walt Kavash's life began with a problem that no other man wanted. The 1970s were a boom time in American agriculture. Corn went from $1.10 a bushel in 1969 to $3.50 by 1974. Land in Decatur County went from $400 an acre to $2,400. Farmers borrowed against the rising values. They bought new John Deere 443Os and 463Os from Harley Briggs's expanded dealership. They built new equipment sheds. They added 40 and 80 and 160 acres at a time to their operations. They behaved, in short, as men behave when they believe that the price of corn and the price of land have entered a new and permanent era. Walt did not expand. Walt did not borrow. Walt continued year after year to farm his original 80 acres, to tile other men's fields on the side, and to put the money week after week into the savings account. His neighbors, who had stopped laughing in 1961 and had started watching him by 1964, did not understand him in 1974. They would drive past the Kovish farmhouse, and they would see the same Farmall M in the same shed it had been in for 17 years, and they would shake their heads the way they had once shaken them at his trenches, except now they shook them in the other direction. Walter, Paul Traeger said to him at the co-op one afternoon in 1977, "You could be farming 1,000 acres with your drainage knowledge. You could be the biggest operator in this county. I could, Paul. Then why, in God's name, are you not? Walt looked at him. He took his time. Walt had not become a talker. He had become, if anything, a man of fewer words as the years went on. Because then I would need a loan, Paul. And I would owe a bank. And my father worked rented ground for 46 years because he owed somebody else. And I watched him work it, and I watched what it did to him. I am not going to owe anyone, Paul. Not the bank, not the seed company, not the tractor company. If I expand when I have the cash. And I do not have the cash to farm 1,000 acres. So I will farm the 80 I can afford, and I will lay tile for the rest, and I will sleep well at night. Walter, the price of corn is not coming back down. The price of corn always comes back down, Paul. Eventually, Paul Traeger shook his head. He went back to loading his truck. He had himself borrowed $290,000 against his farm in 1975 to buy an additional 400 acres and 2 new combines. He was not a reckless man. He was following the advice of his banker, his extension agent, and the agricultural columns in 3 different newspapers. He was doing in 1977 what every prudent farmer in Decatur County was doing. In the summer of 1978, a man in a charcoal suit drove out to Walt Kavash's farmhouse in a leased Oldsmobile and parked in the driveway. His name was James Holder. He was a loan officer from the Farmers Bank in Greensburg, the same bank where Walt had been depositing money for 20 years. He was a young man, 32, newly promoted, ambitious in the way that young loan officers were in 1978, which is to say, eager to put large loans on his books before the party ended. Not that he or anyone else had any idea the party was going to end. Walt met him on the porch. Mr. Kovash? Mr. Holder? May I come in? We can talk on the porch. They talked on the porch. Holder opened a leather folder. He had done his homework. He had run the numbers on the Kovish parcel and the Kovish farmhouse and the Kovish drainage business. And he had come out with paper and pencil and the optimism of his profession with a proposal that he was certain, absolutely certain, Walt Kovish would accept. Mr. Kovash, I am here to offer you a line of credit of $500,000 secured against your land and your equipment. I see. This would allow you to acquire on current market terms approximately 1,000 additional acres in Decatur and Ripley counties. The projected yield improvements you would bring to that land through your drainage system, even amortized over 10 years, would pay the loan in full by 1987 at current commodity prices. You would be by 1988 one of the largest single operators in eastern Indiana. Walt listened. He let Holder finish. He did not interrupt. His father had taught him, among many things, that a man who interrupts has already stopped listening. When Holder was done, Walt said, "No, thank you, Mr. Holder." Holder blinked. He had been expecting discussion. He had not been expecting a 2-word refusal. Mr. Kovash, I wonder if you appreciate the magnitude of the opportunity. I appreciate it. I am declining it. May I ask why? My father never owned land because he always owed somebody. I am not going to owe anybody. Holder looked at him for a long moment. He was a smart young man. He was not yet wise, but he was smart, and he would become wise later. And when he did, he would remember this afternoon on this porch, and he would tell the story at industry lunches for the rest of his career. Mr. Kovash, the price of corn is at $3.80 a bushel. Land is appreciating at 12% a year. Interest rates are reasonable. You will never in your lifetime see a combination of factors this favorable again. Mr. Holder, my father died in 1953 in a rented field because the owner would not fix a steering linkage. I am not going to put myself in a position where another man's steering linkage decides whether I get to sleep tonight. Holder closed his folder. He drove back to Greensburg. He told his manager that the Kavash account was unmovable. His manager shrugged. There were other farmers in the county. There were always other farmers in the county. 4 years later, in the fall of 1982, James Holder's bank was processing bankruptcy paperwork on one of every 7 farms in Decatur County. The numbers of the farm crisis are in every history book on American agriculture, and they do not need to be repeated here in detail. Corn fell from $3.50 to under $2. Interest rates climbed to 18%. Land values in Decatur County collapsed from $2,400 an acre to $800 and in some parcels lower. Farmers who had borrowed at 12% against land worth $2,400 found themselves paying 18% interest on loans secured by land, now worth $800. The math, which had been the math of boom times, became the math of extinction. Paul Traeger lost 400 acres in 1983. He kept the original 100 by the grace of a brother-in-law in Rushville who bought the note. Wendell Loomis lost everything. Arlo Tipton, who was 79 by that point, watched his son go under and did not survive the winter of 1984. Harley Briggs's dealership cut its staff in half. The party, as Walt had quietly predicted in 1977, had come back down. In the fall of 1983, a parcel came up at the courthouse in Greensburg. 80 acres. Wet ground, poor drainage, partially wooded, a failed expansion purchase from a farmer named Meeks, who had borrowed against it in 1976 and could not carry it into 1984. The opening bid was set at $280 an acre. Walt Kovash went to the auction. He wore the same kind of denim coat he had worn in 1959, although this one did not have patches. He stood near the back of the courtroom. He bid once. He paid $23,000 in cash. He walked out with the deed. He bought 2 more parcels on the same terms over the next 3 years. One in 1984, 120 acres for $320 an acre. One in 1986, 40 acres for $350. Total investment, $76,800. Total acreage added 240. Total percent financed 0. He tiled every one of them by hand with the same Farmall M, now 37 years old, and with Curtis, who was 15 years old in 1983, and 19 by the time the last acre of the last parcel was drained. It took them 3 years of summers and weekends. By the fall of 1989, the Kavash operation ran to 320 acres of some of the best drained cropland in Indiana, and the per acre yields on a 5-year rolling average were 134 bushels of corn, which made the Kovash farm, as Oliver Renfro noted in his final report before his retirement that year, the highest yielding single operation in Decatur County. Tom Meeks, who had lost the first of those 3 parcels at the 1983 auction, walked up the driveway of the Kovash farmhouse on an evening in October of 1983, about 4 weeks after the auction. He was 46 years old. He had lost everything. He had the clothes he was wearing, and a wife who had not yet decided whether to stay. He came up the porch steps and knocked on the screen door. Walt came out. "Mr. Kovash." "Tom, I came to ask if you had any work." Walt looked at him for a long moment. He did not look at him with pity. Walt did not have pity in him, and Tom Meeks had not come for pity. He had come for work. "Come in, Tom." Mary left a plate. Walt's housekeeper was a woman named Mary Langford. who came 3 days a week and had that afternoon left a casserole on the stove. Walt heated it up. He put 2 plates on the table. He and Tom Meeks ate in silence the way 2 men eat who do not need to fill the silence. Afterward, Walt got out his field map and he showed Tom the drainage work that still needed doing on the parcel Tom had himself lost. I need a man to supervise the tile crews on the new acreage. I pay straight salary, 75 a week, plus the use of the small house on the east corner of the Trager parcel. Starts Monday. Mr. Kovash, I do not know how to thank you. Do not thank me, Tom. The work is the work. Show up on Monday. Tom Meeks showed up on Monday. He worked for Walter Kovish for 16 years until his retirement in 1999. He supervised every drainage job the Kovish operation did in Decatur County during those years. He was paid a fair wage. He kept his wife, and he raised 2 daughters who went to college. He never in 16 years heard Walter Kovish say one word about the 1983 auction or the circumstances under which he had acquired the parcel. The work for Walt was the work, and the past was the past, and those two things did not need to be stirred together to make either one of them nourish a man. Harlan Briggs retired from the dealership in the spring of 1990. He was 79 years old. The dealership had survived the farm crisis, but it had not thrived in it. And Harley had been forced in 1985 to cut 2 mechanics and a salesman. He never recovered the old energy he had had at the counter. He sold the franchise in March of 1990 to a group out of Columbus, Indiana, for less than it had been worth in 1978. The retirement party was held at the VFW Hall on Friday, March 16th. The day before the party, Walt drove out to the co-op. He went around to the back to the dealership office. Harley was at his desk, sorting through 33 years of filed paperwork into 3 piles keep, shred, and give to the new owners. He looked up when Walt came in. Walter. Harley. Come to buy a John Deere at last. Not today. I brought you something. Walt set a small paper sack on the desk. Harley, with that curious look that he had when a customer surprised him, opened it. Inside was a 4-inch section of clay drainage tile, terracotta broken at one end, dark with 30 years of Indiana subsoil stained into its pores. It is from the main line that drains the East 40, Walt said. Cracked last fall. I had to replace it. It had been in the ground for 30 years. Harley Briggs held the piece of clay tile in his hands. It weighed almost nothing. It looked to any man who did not know like a broken piece of garden pottery. He did not speak for a long time. Walter. 30 years in the ground. Yes, sir. The replacement section went in the same week. The land will last longer than we will. The tile, I figured you should have a piece. You were there at the beginning, Harley. You were the first one who asked, and you were the one who came back. Harley Briggs did something Walt Kovish had not seen him do in 31 years of acquaintance. His eyes filled. He did not weep. A man of his generation, in his line of work, did not weep in his office in front of another man. But his eyes filled, and he had to look away for a moment, and he set the piece of tile very carefully on his desk. You know what I think about sometimes, Walter? That afternoon in this building in March of 1959, you told me you said I've got a different idea about that ground. And I stood there at that counter and I tried to sell you a John Deere 730. I should have asked what the idea was. Instead, I tried to put you in a tractor. You were doing your job, Harley. My job was selling machines. Your job was seeing what nobody else could see. And for 30 years, Walter, I have thought the same thing, and I have never said it, and I'm going to say it now before I clean out this office for the last time. Yes, sir. You had the better idea. In this whole county, in this whole business, in this whole lifetime, you and I have shared here, you had the better idea. And I am sorry it took me 17 months in 1959 and 1960 to come around to it. But I came around. I came around in a field in the dark with a hurricane lamp, and I want you to know that I have not stopped coming around from that day to this. Walt nodded. He did not trust his own voice for a moment. Then he said, Harley, you came around sooner than most men come around to anything. And I took the apology in 1961, and I take it again today, and I will tell you what I told you then. You and I are on good terms. We always have been since that night. Harley Briggs stood up. He did not offer his hand because they had never shaken hands on anything important. He picked up the piece of clay tile and he set it carefully on the corner of the desk, the corner he would keep with him, and he said, This goes home with me. This stays on my mantle for as long as I have a mantle. Yes, sir. Walt walked out of the dealership office for what would turn out to be the last time. He drove home. Harley Briggs died 11 years later in the fall of 2001 at the age of 90 in his daughter's house in Columbus. On his mantle, when his daughter cleaned the house, she found the piece of clay drainage tile and beside it a small card in her father's handwriting. The card said only, from Walter Kovash, the best farmer I ever knew. Walter Kovash retired from active farming in 2004. He was 69 years old. He turned the operation over to Curtis, who ran it with modern equipment, but the same philosophy his father had taught him, which was that water came first and everything else followed. Walt lived for the 20 years after his retirement in the farmhouse on the north edge of the original parcel. He watched his grandchildren, 3 of Curtis's 5, grow up on the ground he had drained. He became in his 80s the kind of old man that younger farmers drove out to see when they were thinking about buying bad ground somewhere, and he would take them around the original 80 acres, walking slowly with a cane. He had carved himself from an ash tree that had come down in a storm, and he would show them the drainage outlets, and he would tell them the story of his father. And he would tell them always the same sentence, which was the sentence his father had told him on a rented field in Rush County in 1950. Water is the whole book. You control the water, you control the land. You lose the water, the land controls you. Some of them listened, some did not. The ones who listened came back later and told him that what he had told them had changed the way they looked at ground. The ones who did not listen, he did not see again, and he did not need to. The original 80 acres continued through the 2010 and into the 2020 to produce between 140 and 160 bushels of corn per acre. The tile system, the original 14,000 feet that Walt had laid by hand in 1959 and 1960, had been replaced in sections over the decades as individual pipes had cracked or collapsed. But the layout itself, the trenches, the grades, the slopes, the outlets at the 2 creeks, remained exactly as Walt Kovash had surveyed them with the borrowed transit level in the spring of 1959, working from a map that a broken down old farmer had handed him across a table at Murphy's Cafe. The Fermal M was in the old machine shed. Curtis's youngest daughter, a girl of 12 named Hannah, asked her grandfather one afternoon in the fall of 2023, as they were walking through the shed together, what the old tractor was worth. Walt stood looking at it for a long time. The paint was faded. The seat was cracked. The left rear tire needed air, as it always had, because the tube had a slow leak that Walt had never bothered to fix properly in 65 years. I paid $175 for it in 1958, Hannah, he said. So that is what it is worth, Grandpa. I used it to tile 320 acres of ground that produce about $400,000 of corn a year every year, and they have done that for most of my life. So it is worth a lot of money now. It is worth $175, Hannah, and it is also worth everything. Hannah thought about that for a minute. She was 12 years old. She did not yet understand what her grandfather meant. She would understand later when she was older and had her own work and her own ground, if she chose ground or her own version of ground, whatever it turned out to be. Walt put his hand on the cracked leather of the tractor seat. He stood there for a long moment, the way a man stands at the grave of an old friend. Then he and Hannah walked out into the late afternoon light, and they walked along the east fence line to the spot where the clear water came out of the 4-inch clay mouth of the drainage outlet, still 65 years after Walter Kovash had laid the last section of that outlet with his own hands at the age of 25. The water was flowing. It had never stopped flowing. 1 inch of fall per 100 feet. The slope his father had taught him. The slope the ground had been waiting for 10,000 years for someone to give to it. What is the difference between worthless land and priceless land? About 3 feet of depth and 3 miles of clay pipe. That is the whole of it. The soil did not change. The climate did not change. The location did not change. The only thing that changed was one man's understanding of water. An understanding passed from a tenant farmer who never owned an acre to a son who bought the worst ground in the county and turned it into the best. Harlan Briggs looked at the Crowder parcel in 1959 and saw mud. Walter Kovash looked at it and saw Brookston clay with a drainage problem. The same ground. Two different pairs of eyes. One man saw failure. The other saw a farm waiting to happen. $3,200. That is what Walter Kovash paid for 80 acres of mud and standing water and 20 years of other men's failures. And from that mud, he built a 320-acre farm, a drainage business that served 4 counties, a family, a son, 3 grandchildren, and a lesson that outlasted every shiny tractor and every bank loan in Decatur County. The worst farm in this county became the best investment anyone ever made. All it took was a man who knew where the water was going and who had the patience to show it the way.